Historical context: the conquest of Terrans by Sangor. 3 centuries ago, the Sangorian Empire invaded the Terran kingdoms and brought them under absolute dominion. Viewing humans as weak, magicless, and inferior, yet exploitable, the Sangorians crushed Terran resistance, occupied their cities, and repurposed their entire civilization as a subjugated resource for the Vampire Empire. The invasion was quick and brutal. Lacking magic and the physical strength of other races, Terrans could not effectively resist the Sangorian military. Within a generation, all major Terran kingdoms had fallen. Their cities still stand, but are now under Sangorian control. Their institutions remain but operate under vampire law. Their people survive as property, not citizens. Those remaining in the conquered lands faced systematic exploitation. Terrans were made to perform labor during daylight hours when vampires were weakest, building roads, tending fields, running markets, and maintaining the Empire's infrastructure while their masters slept. Entire generations were born into bondage, their humanity reduced to a resource. Terran cities turned into workhouses, farms into labor camps. The conquest didn't erase Terran civilization, but reshaped it. Many Terrans served as living sources of sustenance, confined to breeding facilities, and drained to feed vampire nobility. These blood farms became central to Sangorian society, enabling expansion without relying on external hunting. Terran bloodlines are bred, tracked, and harvested like livestock. Not all Terrans accepted subjugation. Some fled the occupied territories, seeking freedom at the Empire's edges. Some escaped to the Thornwood forests, where Versi clans, though cautious of outsiders, offered refuge to those willing to work and integrate into pack life. These exiles live as free people, but remain under threat of Sangorian recapture. Others sought safety in Parva's mountain strongholds, where pragmatic dwarves accepted refugees for labor and expertise in surface world engineering. Parvian mines and forges now host free Terrans rebuilding their lives. Today, Terrans remain a subjugated people. The Sangorian Empire rules with total dominance, extracting labor and blood to fuel expansion. In occupied areas, they are under constant surveillance, their movements limited, their children taken by the state, their lives valued only for their usefulness. Yet, in hidden places, Versi forests, Parvian mines, secret villages, free Terran communities persevere. They remember their past as builders, innovators, and a thriving civilization of kingdoms and cultures. They preserve their histories through whispers and oral tradition, keeping alive the hope for sovereignty and liberation. The Sangorians did not wipe out the Terrans. They conquered, occupied, and continue to exploit them. And the Terrans have not forgotten. Prologue, Before Sunset. The newborn's cry cut through the salt air above Sangor's eastern pier, a sound the daylight city had no answer to. It rose sharp and stubborn, then folded into the cries of gulls and the slow slap of the tide against timber. Fishermen readying their boats paused, glancing toward the sound, before returning to their work, spilling seawater across worn planks. Beyond them, the city climbed in tiers of black stone and darkened glass, its shuttered windows like closed eyes against the sun. Somewhere inland, the bone-white towers of House Nocthrin pierced the sky, their pale spires crowned with braziers that blazed even in daylight, eternal flames fed by blood magic, watching over a city built on conquest and the labor of the defeated. Alaric Nocthrin did not move as his son's voice trembled in the room. He felt it as a weight in his chest, fragile yet absolute. The sound should have been nothing. He had heard 1,000 cries in his centuries of life, had watched empires rise and collapse, had stood unmoved as entire bloodlines were extinguished. Yet this single voice, raw and insistent, undid him. Mira lay exhausted on the narrow bed, her face damp with sweat and salt, blood from the delivery staining the hem of her simple dress. She was the daughter of a Terran. She never knew her father, though in Sangor that word had long since lost its meaning. For 3 centuries, since the Sangorian Empire swept across the Terran kingdoms like a plague, Terran men had been reduced to servants and property, their children claimed by masters rather than by bloodlines. Her deep brown eyes, glazed with exhaustion and pain, searched his face with the desperate clarity of someone who knew exactly how little time they had left. Her hand found his wrist and clutched it with the stubbornness of someone who could not let go. "We must hide him," she whispered, each word a labor. Her breath hitched. "They will not forgive this, Alaric. They'll call him a half-blood heir, contamination. They'll call it treason." "They will do what they always do," Alaric said, his voice low and bitter. The words were an old ache, a wound that never fully healed. He had been born into ceremonies of cruelty, raised in the shadow of his father's conquests, and taught that power was to be seized and held, that mercy was a weakness to be purged. The Noctran bloodline was ancient, pure, and unbroken for 2,000 years. To dilute it with Terran blood, weak, magicless, slave blood, was an unforgivable sin. Yet the infant on Mira's breast had undone that teaching in a single, small, inconsequential way, simply by existing. The fact of his son's breath, the tiny fist curled against Mira's collarbone, and the dark tuft of hair still damp from birth made the palace rules feel like threadbare robes, fragile and arbitrary. Alaric had thought himself beyond such sentiment. He had been wrong. He studied the child with a scholar's intensity, cataloging every detail. The boy's skin was pale, though not as deathly white as that of pure Sangorian infants. When his eyes fluttered open, they were gray, human gray, not the crimson or gold of vampire nobility. There were no signs yet of what he might become. Would he inherit the fire magic that ran in Alaric's veins? The blood manipulation that marked the Noctran line? Would he burn in sunlight, or would his mother's humanity shield him? Would he live centuries or mere decades? Alaric didn't know. The thought terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. A knock at the door sent Mira's hand cold against his wrist. Alaric stiffened, his predatory instincts flaring. The knock was soft, practiced, and carried the rhythm of the watch. 3 beats, a pause, 2 beats. A code. Alaric had expected it. He had arranged it. "Rin," he said, and the name was more relief than a command. Alaric opened the door, and Rin Var stepped into the lamplight with the easy, prowling gait of a man who had run for his life more times than he'd counted. He was Versi, a werewolf, though in his human form. The only obvious signs were the corded muscles of his frame. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a hunter, his silver eyes flashing in the dim light. His hair was cropped close in a warrior's practical style, dark with streaks of premature gray. His forearm bore a faint tattoo of the clan symbol. He was thinner than Alaric remembered. The hard set of his jaw, the new scar along his temple, and the way his hand rested instinctively near the knife at his belt all spoke of a life made lean by danger. Rin had been a soldier once, before he'd deserted the Versi military rather than continue fighting in the endless border wars against Sangor. Alaric had found him 3 years ago, half-starved and hiding in a warehouse on the Sangorian side of the border, a deserter with nowhere left to run. Instead of turning him in for the bounty, Alaric had offered him food, shelter, and safety. What had begun as an act of mercy had grown into something deeper, a genuine friendship built on shared exhaustion with the violence that defined their world. Now, Alaric was calling on that bond, trusting Rin with the most precious thing he had. "Did you secure the passage?" Alaric asked, though he could read the answer in Rin's posture. Rin nodded once, his gaze shifting to the infant. Something in his expression changed, not quite softness, but a recognition of what was at stake. I'll get us across the strait to the Terran coast. We'll move in daylight, when the Sangorian patrols are dormant. From there, we'll travel north through the occupied territories, sticking to back roads and abandoned villages. The Versi border is a 3-day walk if we're careful. Once we cross into Versi lands, we'll have sanctuary. The clans will shelter us, and from there we can reach the Thornwood. Mira tried to rise, her arms tightening around the baby. "Take him, please." Her voice cracked. "They will come for him. Your father—" "My father will hear of this as soon as he awakens," Alaric said quietly. The midwife was loyal, but Gold buys only so much silence in this city. By dawn, the High Council will convene. They will demand that the child be brought before them. He didn't need to say what would happen next. The Nocturne family had a long history of dealing with inconvenient bloodlines. The child would be studied and tested. If he showed any sign of his mother's humanity, any weakness, any lack of magical aptitude, he would be disposed of. Quietly, efficiently. A footnote in the family records. Alaric's bastard, defective, eliminated, or worse, he would be kept alive as a curiosity, a half-breed experiment locked away in the blood farms where Mira's people were bred and drained. Rin stepped forward with the careful deliberation of someone handling something precious and fragile. One rough, calloused hand cupped the baby's head, so small it fit entirely in his palm, while the other steadied Mira's shoulder. "We leave now. The tide turns in an hour." Alaric watched, feeling both relief and a fissure opening in his chest. In this room, in that simple gesture, his son's fate shifted from one world to another, from the suffocating grandeur of Sangorian nobility to the rough, dangerous freedom of the Versi clans, from a life of court intrigue and blood magic to one of survival and pack loyalty. He had made arrangements with Rin on a dozen small, furtive fronts over the past months, ever since Mira had told him she was pregnant. Messages slipped into servants' palms, gold left in the soles of shoes, false records entered into the city's ledgers, and a carefully orchestrated series of bribes and threats, all of which he hoped would create enough confusion to delay pursuit. He had bargained for his son's life with the same clinical deliberation he had used to negotiate territories and alliances, the same cold calculation that had made him one of the most feared diplomats in the Nocturne court. A prince is not supposed to bargain for a child's life. Perhaps that was why his hands shook as he reached into his coat and drew out a small velvet packet and a sealed scrap of parchment. "Gold," he said, handing the packet to Rin. It was heavy enough to cover passage and provisions for months, and papers, forged transit documents for the occupied territories. My seal will get you through the Terran checkpoints without question. After that... He hesitated, and for the first time, fear crept into his voice. "After that, you're beyond my protection, and when my father discovers what I've done..." He met Rin's gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. Years of quiet trust, shared weariness of the endless violence, and a friendship forged in the margins of war. "This might be the last time you see me, my friend." Rin weighed the packet in his hand, then slid it into his pocket, with the ease of a man long accustomed to hiding things. "We'll manage. The Versi clans remember sheltering Terran refugees during the conquest. They'll take in a cub, especially one in need of protection. And the Thornwood packs beyond remember too. They won't turn us away." "Send word when you can," Alaric said, hating how desperate he sounded. "If anything, tell me..." "Tell you what?" Rin's voice was rough, weighted with something deeper than anger. "That he's safe, that he's growing strong, that his father sacrificed everything for him to live?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alaric's jaw tightened, not from accusation, but from the enormity of what he was about to lose and what he had already lost. "Tell him I couldn't keep him alive if he stayed with me," Alaric said quietly. "Tell him when the time comes. Tell him I chose his life over everything, over my position, over my safety, and over ever seeing him again." Rin was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll tell him when he's old enough to understand." He hesitated, then added softer, "You're a good man, Alaric. Better than this empire deserves." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken grief and the weight of what was to come. Finally, Alaric reached out and clasped Rin's shoulder, a gesture that transcended the boundaries of their peoples, a bond forged not in blood or duty, but in shared exhaustion from endless violence and in quiet trust built over years. "Remember the name," he said quietly. "Xylus." Rin inclined his head, then looked down at the infant. The child had stopped crying, his dark gray eyes open and staring up with that unfocused newborn gaze. For a moment the world held only that small face, unmarked by the cruelty that would shape him, innocent of the blood that ran in his veins. "You will name him Silas?" Rin asked. Alaric looked down at the infant in Rin's arms, the small face still red and wrinkled from birth, eyes squeezed shut against the lamplight. "Yes, Silas," he said. He had chosen it moments after Mira informed him that she had become pregnant. The name sounded stubborn and unbreakable, sharp-edged and defiant, unlike the old family names whispered in Sangor's halls, heavy with history and expectation. This one carried no legacy. No one would expect anything of a boy named Xylus. Xylus Nocthrin. Rin's mouth tightened at the surname. "We can't use that. The Thornwood clans won't accept a child with a Sangorian surname. They'll assume he's a spy, or worse. They'll kill him before he can walk." Mira stirred on the bed, her voice thin but steady. "No. Give him my last name. He should be named Silus Soltorig. He would be safer with that name." Rin and Alaric looked at each other, then back at Mira. The fever had begun to creep into her limbs, turning her skin pale and damp, but her eyes held fierce clarity. "Soltorig," Alaric repeated, tasting the word. "I've never heard that name before." Mira smiled faintly, though it cost her. "It is good to be mysterious." Alaric knelt beside the bed and took her hand, feeling the heat of infection radiating from her skin. The delivery had been difficult, too long, too much blood. He could smell the infection beginning, see the grayish pallor settling into her face like ash. She was dying. They both knew it. Terran healers had been forbidden from practicing their own medicine for generations, their knowledge suppressed and their tools destroyed. Sangorian healers wouldn't waste their magic on a conquered woman, especially not one who had committed the crime of bearing a vampire's child. "Silas Solterig," Alaric said quietly. "It's perfect." Rin folded the infant into the crook of his arm with surprising gentleness, cradling the small body against his chest. The baby made a soft sound, a mewling cry that faded into silence as Rin rocked him slightly. "I'll tell him he was found," Rin said quietly, his eyes on the child's face. "I'll tell him he's one of us, a Versi foundling, taken in by the clan." Mira's fingers tightened weakly around Alaric's. "Keep him human," she whispered. "Don't let him be made into what they are. Teach him to be more. Teach him that strength isn't just about taking. That power doesn't have to mean cruelty." Guilt burned through Alaric like wildfire, searing away the careful control he'd kept for centuries. His house demanded perfection. His position required discretion. He had 1,000 reasons to pretend the child meant nothing. He had 1,000 excuses to let the machinery of empire grind forward. But after seeing Xylus's eyes open for the first time, he could not. Instead, he'd planned in darkness, betraying his house and his position, risking everything for a child he would never know. None of it hurt as much as the thought of losing Silas. Not the political consequences, not his father's wrath, not even the certainty that he would be watched for the rest of his immortal life, suspected of weakness, with his every move scrutinized and his power reduced to ceremonial weight and the fragile leverage of debts owed. Alaric nodded slowly, then drew a ring from his finger, a signet bearing the crest of his house. The ring had a golden N and rubies. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, the legacy it carried. "Give this to Xylus when he's of age," he whispered as he pressed it into Rin's hand. "When he is ready, when he's old enough to understand what this means, Give it to him. Tell him only what he needs to know. Tell him his blood is not his fate. Tell him he has a choice. Rin's fingers curled around the ring, his expression unreadable. There was no eulogy on his face, only a practical set of grief, the look of a soldier accepting an impossible mission. He tucked the ring into a hidden pocket in his coat, then turned toward the window. Beyond the darkened glass, the sun was slowly setting, barely visible through the haze of coal smoke that perpetually hung over Sangor's industrial districts. Lanterns bobbed on the pier below, where a small skiff rocked with patient hunger, waiting to carry them away from everything Alaric had ever known. "Go," Alaric said, his command softening to a plea. "Before the sun sets, before anyone thinks to check the eastern docks." Rin hesitated at the doorway, the bundled child secure against his chest. He looked back at Mira, who had closed her eyes, her breathing shallow and labored. Then he bowed, not the forced deference of the conquered to their masters, but the deep, respectful bow of one warrior to another. She opened her eyes just a little, fighting to focus on him through the fever. Her voice came out barely more than a whisper. "Promise me, please. Keep him human. Keep him safe. Tell him I love—" Her breath caught. The words died unfinished. Rin's jaw tightened as grief flashed across his features before he locked it away. "I'll keep him safe," he said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of his vow. "On my life, I promise, Mira. He'll grow strong. He'll grow free." The light faded from her eyes. Rin tucked the infant against his chest, wrapping his heavy cloak around the small body to shield him from the sun. Then he slipped like a shadow through the servants' corridor, down the narrow stairs to the alley behind the boarding house, and out toward the dock. The city smelled of brine, coal, and fate. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour, 3 chimes, signaling that night approached. Rin moved quickly, his Versi senses alert for any sign of pursuit, the infant's warmth a small, precious weight against his heart. As the door closed behind Rin, Alaric remained at Mira's side. Her chest no longer rose. Her eyes stared unseeing at the ceiling, the light already gone from them. He reached out with trembling hands and gently closed her eyelids, his fingers lingering on her cold skin. In life, she had touched his cheek once, months ago, when they'd first spoken of this plan. Her fingers had been warm then, her pulse strong. Her eyes had brimmed with sorrow and something that might have been forgiveness, silently asking what neither of them could answer. Will he be happy? Will he be safe? Will he ever understand why we did this? "Keep him human," she had breathed then, each word an effort even in health. It had been less a plea than a prayer, a benediction whispered into the void. Don't let them make him a monster. Now, in the silence of her death, Alaric bowed his head. "He won't be," he whispered to her stillness, though she could no longer hear. "I swear it, Mira. He'll grow up free." The promise hung in the air, binding him to a child he would never know, and to a woman who had trusted him with everything. He stayed motionless until the sun began to set, and the approach of night forced him to leave her behind. Alaric bowed his head, pressing his forehead against hers, letting the silence hang between them. Heavy and sharp as a blade, he could have saved her with his blood magic. But doing so would condemn her to something far worse than dying here, in peace, with the knowledge that her son was safe. Once his father discovered their son, they would rip through her mind with blood magic, peel back every memory, every whispered word, every moment of the plan. They would break her slowly, methodically, until nothing was left but agony and the answers they sought. Death now was mercy. Death now was the only protection he could still offer her, and even if he tried to send her with Rin, she would not survive the journey. Her body was failing, her breathing shallow and labored. Moving her would kill her before they reached the border and risk exposing Rin, the child, and everything they had sacrificed to build. So he held her instead and let her go. He sat there for a long time, holding her cooling hand, listening to the city settle beyond the window. He had killed men before, hundreds of them, across centuries of warfare and political maneuvering. He had thought himself hardened to death, immune to the small tragedies that plagued lesser beings. He had been wrong about that, too. Finally, as the first stars pierced the darkening sky, Alaric rose. He arranged Mira's body with care, crossing her hands over her chest and closing her eyes with gentle fingers. He would send someone discreet to collect her later, someone who would see that she was buried properly, not dumped in the mass graves where most Terran dead ended up. It was the least he could do. It was pitifully, pathetically little. He moved to the window and looked out over the harbor. The skiff was gone, vanished into the night mist clinging to the water. Somewhere out there, Rin was carrying his son away from this place, from the towers, the blood farms, and the eternal flames that burned in the Nocturne spires. Alaric pressed his palm against the glass, feeling the cool night air seep through the pane. In a few minutes, he would need to leave, returning to the palace through the shadowed streets, now safe for his kind. He would face his father's rage, endure the investigation, and lie with the same cold precision he had used to negotiate treaties. He would survive this, he always did. But as he turned away from the window, Alaric Nocturne, prince of the oldest vampire bloodline, diplomat and warrior, architect of conquest, felt something he had not felt in 3 centuries of immortal life. He felt alone. The skiff cut through the water with barely a whisper, its single sail catching the wind. Rin sat in the stern, one hand on the tiller, the other cradling the infant against his chest. The baby Xylus had fallen asleep, his tiny face peaceful, a sight that tightened Rin's throat. Finally, the skiff reached the boat that awaited Rin deep in the sea. The Terran sailors who crewed the boat said nothing, their faces grim and weathered. They were free Terrans, part of the scattered population that had escaped Sangorian conquest by fleeing to the Versi. They had no love for Sangor, and even less for the Nocturne family. But they owed the Versi clans a debt, and the Versi paid their debts, and expected the same in return. Among them sat a young woman with a bundle of cloth across her lap, her eyes soft when they fell on the infant. A wet nurse, Rin and Alaric had thought of everything. The journey would take days, and the child would need to be fed long before they reached Versi soil. "Where to, again?" the captain asked finally, her voice rough from years of salt air and hard living. "Terran," Rin said. "We are going to your Terran shores." The captain nodded slowly, with a sarcastic smile. "Our shores? Maybe once, but not in my lifetime." Her eyes now dropping to the infant. "Half-blood?" she asked. "Does it matter?" Rin responded. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose it doesn't. The Sangorians will look for him." "Let them look," Rin said, feeling the weight of the promise he'd made settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. "They won't find him, not where we're going." The captain said nothing more, and they sailed through the night until dawn. Far behind them, barely visible, Sangor's towers glowed with reflected moonlight, their bone-white stone turning gold before fading into the distance as the city shrank to a smudge on the horizon. Rin looked down at the sleeping child and thought about the ring hidden in his coat pocket, the name he'd been told to remember, and the life this boy would have. A life of half-truths and careful secrets, of growing up between worlds, belonging fully to neither. "Your father's a fool," Rin murmured to the infant, "but maybe a brave one. We'll see." Xylus stirred in his sleep, one tiny hand curling into a fist. Rin felt something unexpected bloom in his chest. Not quite hope, but something close to it. Purpose, perhaps. He had failed his people when he deserted, abandoning his post rather than becoming the monster his superiors demanded he be. But this child, this small, impossible child, he could save. He could raise him strong, teach him to survive, and grant him the freedom his mother had died to secure. It wouldn't redeem him, nothing could do that, but it was a start. The sea was a sheet of black, under a scatter of cold stars. The boat navigated through the inked swell until it finally reached Terran shore. From there, Rin would go towards Versi and into the thornwood forests, which stood dark, deep, and full of secrets, offering the kind of refuge the Empire's gaze could not easily find.